Um, the tangled web of deceit and destruction that we looked at last week that could have made any kind of, I called it a Lifetime movie. It could have all been avoided if those involved had just honored the word of the Lord and paid less attention to their own lusts. I was talking to a girl this week at work, and not really witnessing to her, but we were just talking and the thing about, the Bible came up, and was talking about forgiveness of sins and stuff, and, she brought up, well, if you just ask God to forgive you, you're good. I said, yeah, you're right, but there's consequences. God will forgive your sins, absolutely. But there's consequences for what you did. All of this stuff that we're studying and looking at, everything that's happening, with Amon doing what he did to his sister Tamar last week, and then Absalom, we're going to really look at what Absalom did now. Everything that they did all stemmed from David walking out on the balcony and looking over and seeing Bathsheba taking a bath, and then David acting on his lust. All of that, if that had never happened, none of this would have happened. There is consequences for sin. God will forgive you, absolutely. But we have that free will. Nathan predicted that the sword would never depart from the house of David. And now we see the division in David's family spread into a division into an entire nation. Proverbs 6, verses 16 through 19. There's a list of 7 things that God hates. Everybody says, oh, well, you're not supposed to hate. God hates. And if God hates these things, we should hate these things. So don't tell me I shouldn't hate things. Because the Word of God tells me that these 6 things doth the Lord hate. Yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. A proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that deviseth wicked imaginations, feet that be swift in running to mischief, a false witness that speaketh lies, and he that soweth discord among the brethren. Folks, God hates that. It's an abomination to him. And I'm telling you right now, don't let somebody tell you, oh, it's not right to hate. It's okay to hate these 7 things, 6 things. They're an abomination to God. And I bring that out because every single one of these are personified in the activity of Absalom, David's son. We're going to look at that this morning. Absalom was a handsome man, and his father truly loved him. David loved his son. And we will never know what good might have been done if he had just chosen to use his talents as God directed. Instead, Absalom followed the path of selfishness. He did what he wanted to do. And evidently, he wanted to be king for some time. And this plot to overthrow the kingdom of David wasn't just only a rebellion against David, but it was also a rebellion against God. Folks, listen to what I'm about to say. God anointed David. God didn't anoint Absalom. God anointed David. We should learn that when we oppose the duly appointed, now listen to what I'm saying. We should learn that when we oppose the duly appointed representative of God, we're opposing God. And we also need to learn that there are many things that may be within our own power to do, but just because they're within our power to do, it may not be right to do them. Absalom may have pursued a twisted justice in taking revenge for his sister Tamar in the way he did it. He might have thought that that was justice. But there's no excuse other than just his own ambition for his own rebellion. I happen to believe that Absalom wanted to be king, And that was just an avenue that he took as a way to get through it. But as we look at this incident this morning, we need to remember the seeds of this trouble were sown. Everything that's happening is happening because David was on the balcony that night, looked across the way and saw Bathsheba taking a bath. And then David acted in his own lust. If that had never happened, I guarantee you we'd never be reading about any of this. God will forgive you your sins, absolutely. But folks, there are consequences to things. 2 Samuel chapter 15, let's look at verses 1 through 6. And it says, "And it came to pass after this that Absalom prepared him chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom rose up early and stood beside the way of the gate. And it was so that when any man that had a controversy came to the king for judgment, then Absalom called unto him and said, Of what city art thou? And they said, Thy servant is one of the tribes of Israel. And Absalom said unto him, See, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee. Absalom said, Moreover, oh, that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice. And it was so, and when any man came nigh to him to do him obeisance, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. And on this manner did Absalom to all of Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel." Here's what Absalom is doing. David's son Absalom. If you remember, David had brought Absalom back from Geshur, kind of put him on house arrest, told him he had to stay on his own property and land. That's not what Absalom wanted to do. So Absalom goes and he stands at the gate. Back then, if you had a problem, you went to the king with it. And the king would either decide, yes, you can do what you want to do, or no, you can't do what you want to do. Absalom is undermining David here by doing what he's doing. He's standing at the gate, and anybody that comes to King David with a problem, well, he's just telling them what they want to hear. Anybody seen a political ad lately? That's all they're doing is telling you what you want to hear. After Absalom returned from his exile in Geshur, he began to undermine the authority of David. King David, his dad. Absalom would have been next in line if something had happened to David to be king. His plan was to cast doubt on the words of what the king said. So he gathered an impressive entourage, and he took a position at the gate of the city. So when people would come in for the king's judgment, Absalom would tell them their matters were good. You're right. And that if he were judge of the land, everyone would get justice. Of course, some of those who appeared before the king lost their case. If you didn't get what you wanted when you were a little kid, let's say you went to your mom and you say, "Hey, Mom, can I take the 67 Chevelle Super Sport out on my date Friday night?" Mom says, "No." Then you might go over to your dad and say, "Hey, Dad, can I take the Chevelle out tonight?" Your dad's a car guy, right? This is a true story. Dad said, "Sure. Just make sure it's got gas in it." These people were coming to King David. They weren't getting what they wanted. They didn't get their way. So then as they're leaving, Absalom says, "Hey, you're right, man. He don't know what he's talking about." It's always easy to criticize. Those on the sidelines always seem to know how to do what the leaders are not able to do. DJ, how many times have you watched a football game and said, if they had just done this, we're going to do it today, I bet. Have y'all seen that commercial where I think it's a Florida team playing and the guy says, "Just pass the ball, just pass the ball." You know, and the quarterback looks and says, "I hear you, man. You just want to be heard, right? Just pass the ball." There'll be a lot of armchair quarterbacks today. There always has been, there always will be. Those on the sidelines always seem to know how to exactly do what the leaders are not able to do. But when they're in a position of authority, that's a whole nother story. The truth is, Absalom was a very sorry leader. He divided his nation, and he got as many of his followers killed. But at the beginning, many in Israel fell for his smooth talk. There's a word called ingratiating. Anybody know what the word ingratiating means? Ingratiating. I had to look it up. A suck-up. That's a great, I didn't even think about that. We'll call it the suck-up word. If I'm ingratiating you, I'm telling you what you want to hear. I'm telling you exactly what you want to hear. The Bears are going to win today. And if you're an LA fan, the Rams are going to win today. Now, both of them can't win. Ingratiating. They fell for Absalom's smooth talk. They fell for Absalom's, as Anita put it, suck-up talk. Even today in our information age, we see those who win the masses just by simply promising them whatever they desire. Paul referred to these teachers as having itching ears in 2 Timothy 4:3. Folks, in matters of doctrine as well as matters of government, souls are led astray by the false promises made by those who harbor, listen to what I'm about to say, who harbor secret ambitions. I don't care. Here's you a little warning. If you're ever talking to somebody and they're just 100% agreeing with whatever you say, number one, they probably don't care about anything you're talking about. Number two, they're just listening to you to appease you. Several years had went by, and eventually this rebellion was brought out into the open. And this all took place about 30 years into the reign of David. So he'd been king for about 30 years. Absalom, David's son, had been under some control since the murder of Amnon. We looked at that last week. And now he asked to be allowed to go to Hebron to pay a vow that he made to the Lord. And while he was exiled in Geshur, he stated that he had promised he would serve the Lord if God allowed him to return to Jerusalem. And if you remember at the end of last week's lesson, David gave Absalom permission to travel to Hebron. Absalom knew Jerusalem was filled with people loyal to David. And he began his rebellion in Hebron. And he gained a foothold with a band of followers, and before he could be stopped, he literally had taken over the nation. He'd gotten all these people on his side. He told them exactly what they wanted to hear. Look at chapter 15 of 2 Samuel. I want to look at verses 13 through 18 now. And it says, "And there came a messenger to David, saying, The hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. And David said unto all his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, Arise, and let us flee. For we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring evil upon us, and smite the city with the edge of the sword. And the king's servants said unto the king, Behold, thy servants are ready to do whatsoever my lord the king shall appoint. And the king went forth, and all his household after him, and the king left 10 women, which were concubines, to keep the house. And the king went forth, and all the people after him, and tarried in a place that was afar off. And all his servants passed on beside him, and all the Cherethites, and all the Pelethites, and all the Gittites, 600 men which came after him from Gath, passed on before the king. Now skip down to verse 30, because this is important. We're going to discuss this. And it says, And David went up by the ascent of Mount Olivet, and wept as he went up, and had his head covered, and he went barefoot, and all the people that was with him covered every man his head. And they went up weeping as they went up. Now that's important, because these verses that we just looked at, I want to discuss what is happening here. This was a messenger who had exaggerated his message. The truth was bad enough. But this unnamed messenger made it worse. He told David that the hearts of the men of Israel, implying that all the men in Israel, were with Absalom. That was never the case. Many did follow Absalom. But David still had a loyal following. Even in the darkest hour, he had a loyal following. We always tend to pay more attention to our enemies than we do our friends, don't we? Somebody's talking bad about you. You dwell on that more than you dwell about any other thing. So-and-so said I didn't look good. Who cares what so-and-so said? But you'll dwell on that all day long. All day long, you'll dwell on the bad more than you will the good. We always pay more attention to our enemies than we do our own friends. Absalom had stolen the hearts of a lot of Israelites. He really had. And now he was safely out of David's reach because David had allowed him to go to Hebron. He was surrounded by an army, and he was ruling from Hebron. You got to remember, keep this in mind. Absalom was David's son. And David loved him. No matter what Absalom was doing, David loved his son. You never stop being a father, no matter how your children might behave. Children can do the worst things on earth, and you're still going to love them because they're your kids. Long after Absalom had lost respect and reverence for David, David still loved him. And this also fulfills the prophecy of Nathan, that evil would rise against David from his own house in 2 Samuel 12, verse 11. Perhaps David realized that this was related to his sins in the past, of where he had committed adultery with Bathsheba and then sent her husband Uriah off to be killed with his own death warrant in his hand. The result is that David decided to flee Jerusalem. David did not want a direct confrontation with Absalom. He didn't want a battle in the streets of his city. This was not fear because David was a great and fearless fighter. David simply did not want to have to face his son in battle. And he ordered his servants to flee with him. And a lot of his servants, many were faithful to him. They agreed to do whatever he asked of them. And David abandoned the throne for a short time, leaving only 10 women to keep up his palace in his absence. David and this company left Jerusalem, headed east in mourning. They were barefoot, folks. They had their heads covered. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 16 now. Let's skip ahead a little bit of the story and get to the meat of it. This is where Absalom occupies Jerusalem. 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 15 says, And Absalom and all the people of the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel with him. Now, this Ahithophel, we're going to talk about this fella here in a second because he's very important to this story. But skip down to verse 21 and 22 of chapter 16. And Ahithophel said unto Absalom, Go in unto thy father's concubines, which he had left to keep the house, and all Israel shall hear that thou art abhorred of thy father. Then shall the hands of all that are with thee be strong. So they spread Absalom a tent upon the top of the house, and Absalom went in unto his father's concubines in the sight of all of Israel. He did this so that everybody in Israel could see what was going on. But here's what is important. This feller Ahithophel, and I know I'm probably screwing his name up. That's just how I pronounce it. Absalom now had moved from Hebron to Jerusalem, and he was occupying the city. And Ahithophel, here's what we know about him. He had once been a counselor to King David. But he switched his loyalty to Absalom and was now advising the new king. Absalom's in the king's palace. He's on top, and they put a big tent up there. Everybody in Jerusalem can see what's going on, and he sees him up there with David's concubines. Everybody in Jerusalem's seeing what's happening. They did this on purpose. And Ahithophel was the one that told him to do this. And Ahithophel used to counsel David, but now he's counseling Absalom. Why would he do that, you think? Why would he swap sides? Well, here's who Ahithophel is. Ahithophel advised Absalom to make a public show of his power by taking the 10 concubines. David had left in charge of his palace. The idea was to show that Absalom was the strong man in this situation. And in a sad spectacle, Absalom spread a tent on the top of the palace and publicly went to his father's concubines. It was showing contempt for David. Ahithophel wanted to take an army of 12,000 men and pursue David and those with him. The plan was to kill only King David. However, a guy named Hushai, David's friend, had stayed in Jerusalem, and he persuaded Absalom to gather an army from all of Israel and then pursue David. This gave David time to gather his own army and prepare for the ensuing battle. Absalom took the advice of Hushai, and then Ahithophel saw that his counsel wasn't followed. He went home and hanged himself. This left Absalom on his own and following a plan devised by a friend of King David. Here we see that God was working behind the scenes. This Ahithophel feller, let me make sure I'm getting this right. This Ahithophel fella. Hold on one second, make sure I knew where I'm at. Make sure I haven't skipped anything. Remember Tamar last week? Who was Tamar? Absalom's sister, right? Ahithophel was Tamar's granddad. His son was Tamar's father. You think Ahithophel had some type of something else in the skin of the game? He was mad at David too. Let me make sure I got that right. Why otherwise would Ahithophel quit advising David and start advising the guy who was going to take over David? Anyway, Absalom gathered his army and pursued David to a place called Mahanaim. And near this city was a great forest called the Wood of Ephraim. And this was going to be the scene of the great battle. This was going to be where Absalom got his rebellion. Here, two great armies fought and men died. You know who else died in this battle? Absalom. Because of the sin of David, this so-called victimless sin of adultery, going all the way back to Bathsheba. Let's go back. This is where all this happened from. Brought about the death of over 20,000 men. And these men were not completely innocent in this matter. Each one chose his side. But there was a lingering harvest of evil which came from David's sin with Bathsheba. Folks, it all goes back to that. If that had never happened, we wouldn't be reading about all this. And we wouldn't be reading about a battle with 20,000 guys dying and Absalom dying. But there's more to this story here about how King David. Look at chapter 18, verses 14 through 15. Then said Joab, I may not tarry with thee. And he took 3 darts in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. And 10 young men that bare Joab's armor compassed about and smote Absalom and slew him. Folks, remember why did David leave Jerusalem? He didn't want to fight his son. He didn't want to see his son die. In the great battle that ensued, David gave very strict orders to his army to deal gently with Absalom. Note the great contrast between David's order and what Absalom wanted. Absalom wanted David killed. He wanted to be king, so he had to get rid of David. And to do that, you had to kill him. And Ahithophel's plan called for only King David to be killed in 2 Samuel chapter 17, verse 2. All the others who fled were to be left alive and brought back to Jerusalem. David wanted Absalom spared no matter how many people might be killed. David loved Absalom, folks. It was his son. He didn't want to see him die. But his son was motivated by jealousy and selfishness. Folks, this was a battle that no one truly won. Absalom did not get what he wanted, neither did David. This great and terrible battle cost the lives of over 20,000 men in Israel, and it raged over a vast area of territory. The terrain accounted for a lot of casualties, just the terrain itself. There were swamps and pits and wild beasts that could kill anybody where they were fighting. And as we learned in the account of Absalom's death, this was a dangerous place to ride an animal. Because if you read that, Absalom was on a mule and he was riding. And remember about Absalom being a really beautiful guy? He was good looking, probably had long curly hair, probably had a nice beard. He was riding along on this mule, and all of a sudden a low branch came by, and probably hair and that beard got caught up in it and ripped him off the mule. Read the story. That's what happened. Sometimes good looks cost you things. So Absalom's up here in this tree swinging by his good look. That's the way I read the story. His mule kept on going, and he was tangled up in the branches, just swinging, helpless, and it cost him his life. That's just the way I read it this morning. Let me get back to the story. So when the battle went up against him, Absalom did not know what to do. So he led a great army, and he expected a great victory. His treachery served him well up to this point, but like so many shallow men, his victories had come only because others had chosen. David didn't want to fight in Jerusalem. He did not want to fight his own son. And when the real battle began, he was not a leader. He looked good, but his campaign to kill David was a failure. And in the course of the battle, Absalom came upon some of the soldiers of King David. He did not know these men were under the orders to do him no harm. And he tried to flee from them using his mount, his mule, riding through the woods. And as he passed under a large oak tree, his head was caught in the tree, and he got ripped off his mule. Absalom was not able to free himself. He was suspended in air. He was alive, folks. He was just hanging there by his pretty little head, caught up in the vines, waiting for somebody to find him. And in this moment, this rebel leader was helpless and alone. Folks, your life can change in a heartbeat, and the proud can be brought to a condition of total dependence, as what was happening here with Absalom. He was at the mercy of whoever found him. The soldiers did not kill Absalom, but reported to Joab that he was caught. He's over there helpless in a tree swinging by his pretty hair. And Joab immediately went to the spot and thrust 3 darts through Absalom's heart as he hung in the tree. Absalom, the handsome rebel, met a horrible death. Look at verse 32 and 33 of chapter 18 of 2 Samuel. Because this is David's grief. And the king said unto Cushai, is the young man Absalom safe? And Cushai answered, the enemies of my lord the king, and all that rise against thee to do thee hurt, as that young man is. And the king was much moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, thus he said, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son. Cushai delivered the message that Absalom was dead. And David seemed to forget the joy of the battle that had been won, and selfishly thought of his own loss. Remember that 20,000, the other 20,000 soldiers that died in this battle? They had dads too. King wasn't concerned about those 20,000 fathers losing their son. He was only concerned about his own son that was killed. And maybe that's because he'd given strict orders not to hurt him. When his baby died, David correctly reasoned that he could not bring the baby back, but that he could go to him. And here, David may have been realizing the terrible truth that his son might be eternally lost with no hope of seeing him ever again. not even in eternity. Maybe that's why David was so upset that Absalom had been killed. Folks, when our kids do things that are wrong, we still love them. We still want to see them corrected, and maybe we can help them out. Maybe that's how David was feeling. He knew Absalom didn't trust in the Lord, and he now knew that Absalom would never trust in the Lord. Folks, if David had died, he would have gone to heaven. If Absalom had lived, he might have had the chance to repent and make things right with God. And in this light, you can better understand why David grieved so much. David's army had won a very great victory, and they could now return to Jerusalem to fulfill the anointing of God to be king of Israel. But his life would always be scarred by the rebellion and death of his son. And David had learned about the terrible price that is to be paid even for forgiveness of sins. He had repented of everything that had gone on with Bathsheba and the killing of Uriah, but he was still having to deal with the consequences of that sin. And the sword never left David's family. David was kind of guilty of killing his own son, if you look at it. Absalom would have never have died if David had never committed the sin with Bathsheba. Folks, the moral of this lesson is the wages of sin is death. David experienced the death of a baby that he hardly knew, and he experienced the death of his son Amnon, and now he also saw the death of his beloved son Absalom. No matter what David did to try to help things out, don't hurt Absalom. No matter what order King David gave, Absalom was dead and nothing was going to change that. And David's servants wisely counseled the king not to go overboard in his grief. You know, it must have been a disappointment to the army to return in triumph after a great victory. It must have disappointed the army a great deal after they won this great battle to come back to Jerusalem and find the king mourning, because the leader of the enemy that they were fighting was dead. Remember that 20,000 men had perished in this battle. Every one of them had relatives to mourn their deaths. And the grief of these unknown parents was as meaningful as the grief of David. David did come to his senses and would once again reign in Jerusalem, and we'll look at David's return next week. But I keep saying this every week as we look at these lessons. Everything we're reading about and studying about happened because of David's sin with Bathsheba. And if that had been all that had happened, I wondered if maybe we wouldn't have had the story that we have, because it wasn't just the adultery with Bathsheba. It was then David tried to cover up his sin. And we do that too. What did David do? He sent Uriah. He said, hey, come on back, sleep with your, go into your wife. You ain't got to be at the battle. That didn't work. David was left, okay, we got to get rid of Uriah. So he sends him back to battle with a note. And the note says for Uriah to stand at the front of the line. And what happens if you're at the very front? Chances are you're going to be killed. David pretty much made sure that Uriah would die. Then nobody would know. Just dug his hole deeper, didn't he? And then when Nathan tells David, this is what God, hey, yeah, you're forgiven, but this is what's going to happen now. Everything we read about Tamar last week, her brother Amnon, her half-brother Absalom killing Amnon to revenge Tamar. And then I find it very interesting, if you do a little study on this Ahithophel feller, he had his own agenda too. It'd make a great story for a movie, wouldn't it? Mystery, thriller, murder. Don't tell me the Bible's not exciting, folks. You'll watch this same stuff on TV. Next week, we'll look at David's return.